Have you ever tried to set a boundary with someone and realized that it's not working? That no matter what you do, no matter what you say, it's not getting across. Today we're going to talk about three very important aspects to boundaries and how to communicate them and how to break them down. We're going to talk a little bit about how boundaries come across, why they're important, and how to communicate them. There's three really simple aspects to setting boundaries that I thought, in a beginning conversation of boundaries would be really important to highlight. And I do this with all of my clients in my clinical practice. The first thing you need to do with your boundaries is understand just basic information, which is a boundary isn't a rule, right, that you set on somebody else. A boundary is a guideline for yourself. And I share with clients, first and foremost, as we build our awareness and our insight, it's important to understand where I end and the other person begins, right? So if you have a situation with somebody that's doing something that you don't like, we can't anticipate or control what they're going to do, right? Which means I can't tell that person not to engage in that behavior. What I can do is decide whether or not I want to engage in that behavior with that person at that time or not. So there's three really important things that we need to do with our boundaries. The first is set limits and be clear about what those limits are. The second is communicate clearly, directly. And the third is to be consistent with our boundaries. And we'll get into each of those, but what I share with people about boundaries is I want you to imagine that there's like an energy force field, right? And it's a fun way to think about it. I'm not saying that this is like woo-woo and actually exists. I'm just sharing with you. Imagine for a second that you have a barrier out in front of you that is for protection. And the importance of this is it keeps people from getting in and hurting you, right? And that first force field does that effectively when we set limits, communicate directly, and when we're consistent, right? But we want to start to set up that protection. And then secondly, we have containment, a force field really inside of ourselves that keeps us from harming other people, right? And if we can manage those two things effectively, right, protecting ourselves from violations and containing ourselves from violating others, we're already in relationships and in dynamics with people going to be doing infinitely better. And that's a really powerful, positive way I would just like to insert in this conversation to start with our boundaries is understanding I can't place limits on other people, but I can keep myself from harming others and I can keep them from harming me. And a big way in the beginning to keep from being harmed is to really start to remove yourself from scenarios with people who have a history of hurting you. But again, all of these topics, right, we'll talk about in more videos as we go. But I want to talk a little bit about setting your limits. So the first really important thing with setting limits is to understand what you're comfortable with and what you're not comfortable with. And you'll find in my work that I'm a huge proponent of journaling and writing. So getting really clear with your limits, you can get as clear as black and white on paper. Sit down and write out what you're comfortable with in your relationships and what you're not comfortable with. If you're not comfortable with certain people invading your space, figure out why. Sit down and write out why and how much space you need and in what scenarios. A common one that I'll hear with my clients in my clinical practice who are professionals is like in their professional settings, they may not like it when people walk into their cubicle uninvited, right? And so if you work in a cubicle, you could communicate to someone clearly, hey, this is my space, and I would just ask that you announce when you're coming in, right? Don't just come in and sit on part of my desk, or if you have an office, very similar. You'll find that a lot of it is your ability to speak up for yourself, but I digress on that. Setting limits, right, and knowing your limits is really important. So if you're not a hugger, right, you probably shouldn't be just letting people hug you all the time or engaging in that behavior yourself. So knowing that that's uncomfortable for you, and then you can communicate that to people. And you'll find, right, as we lead into communicating clearly, that an essential part of our boundaries is being able to articulate them, being able to say them to other people. And if that fails with people who are really not good at honoring boundaries, then we can remove ourselves from the situation. But we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. With setting your limits, you want to be clear so that the other person knows what the guideline is. And again, it's not a rule, it's not a hard, fast rule, because you can't get that other person to change their behavior, right? No matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, people are going to behave the way that they behave. And so you've got to be really clearly with how you're going to behave. And I share with people that it starts with our talking boundary. When this happens, I am going to do this. And if you've done that effectively in relationships, you can also add vulnerable requests like, and I would hope that you can honor that, or in the future, can you do this or that, right? So if I don't like to be hugged, I'm going to communicate, hey, when you try to hug me, I feel uncomfortable, all right? And I would really hope that you could respect that and not try to hug me. Then I use physical example there, like hugging, because it's a very universal, relatable experience in boundaries. Physical space is a huge one, right? So we want to protect our physical corporal body, and we also want to protect our emotions. So if you're not big on physical affection, you want to communicate clearly and often that you're not comfortable with it, and it makes you feel a certain kind of way, because we can't assume that that person knows what you're comfortable with or uncomfortable with. And that's a huge part of boundaries, is communicating clearly, which is our second point. When you're sharing your boundaries, you don't want to assume that the person knows what your boundary or guideline for the way you behave is. They have a way that they behave in the world, and you have a way that you behave. And if those two things clash, you'll know pretty quickly. I mean, we've all been around when someone is engaged in behaviors that we don't like, all right? But trying to stop them from doing it is probably not a very effective tactic. So communicating clearly that you don't like it is a good start. Letting someone know, let's say they're drinking too much, right? Good luck stopping that person from drinking, but you can remove yourself from that situation, or communicate that you're uncomfortable in that situation, or it's really hard to watch them drink and get belligerent or get blackout drunk. You can communicate those things very clearly. And you'll notice a trend in our boundaries, and especially when we verbalize them, that a big part of it is how we feel. And I want to be really clear. I'm a huge advocator for our emotional experiences being real, but that's not always the universal truth, right? So be really careful to acknowledge my emotions aren't the universal truth in this situation, but they are real for me, right? And that's a huge part of setting boundaries too, is I may feel uncomfortable, that person may not in this situation. And you see that in families and in relationships and friendships all the time, where somebody's really comfortable with a certain behavior and the other person isn't, but it's not being communicated why that other person isn't comfortable, so the behavior just continues, right? So if you really want to see change in your relationships for yourself, start communicating your emotional experiences. And I tell my clients this is, just because the other person doesn't change their behavior doesn't mean they don't care about you, but you'll find out really quick with your boundaries and communicating your emotions clearly, the people who really do care about you, at the very least, are going to stop behaving that way around you, right? They may not stop that behavior entirely, but they'll stop behaving that way around you. And that's the whole hope with boundaries, right? And we want to communicate them clearly because people don't know where the line is for you, all right? You can't place a line on somebody else because they have their own mode of operation, the way that they think about the world, the way they behave. So if you set the line for yourself, this is how far I'm going to go in this interaction, then they know clearly, because you've communicated it, what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. And we want to be very clear. I like to use the example of, someone who is excessively drinking, because it gives an extreme, right, example, and can be related to so many other situations. Is if I am around someone who's drinking too much or too heavily, I'm not going to partake. That's a very clear boundary that I communicate in my friendships and relationships. I may have a drink on a special occasion, but if we're out and about, I'm not going to be drinking to excess. So if you start asking me, I'd like you to know ahead of time, I'm not going to partake. If that person starts drinking to excess and then starts the peer pressure, I'm going to say no, right? If they continue, comes back to what we were talking about earlier, if they continue to press, I've already stated my boundary, and if it's not being understood or honored or respected, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. And I'd like to reinforce anybody listening to this. Sometimes the best way to hold a boundary with people who don't respect, your situation is to get yourself out of the situation. And when you do those things, you'll feel infinitely better. It's hard in the moment because you may care about that person or they may be a really good friend and you may not want to hurt their feelings, but you've got to prioritize yourself, which is the whole point of setting healthy boundaries. Which brings us to our third point. Our third point is be consistent. If I'm telling somebody that this is my boundary, all right, this is how I'm going to behave, I have to be consistent with that boundary. If we use the example from a moment ago, if I've told somebody I'm not going to be drinking to excess, right? You can drink to excess if you want. I'm not going to partake. And then, that night or the next time we go out, I do. That's on me, right? As to why they may push and not respect my boundary. And a lot of us may have found ourselves in those situations over the years with a multitude of behaviors where I told my friends I wasn't going to do this, but the very next time we went out, I did it. And now every time they push for that, and it's really hard for me to say no and get out of that situation. So be consistent. If your boundary is not engaging in a certain behavior, don't under any circumstances engage in it. All right? No matter how somebody else feels about it. And I always tell my clients this, as far as being consistent with boundaries. A boundary is a broken record. Let's say you're having a hard time with a family member and they really are pushing your buttons, and your answer is no, right? I'm not going to do the thing that you want me to do. Let's say you're an adult and your mom has an opinion about the way that you should be living your life, but your answer is no, I'm not going to do it the way you want me to do it. But every time she brings it up, let's say it's folding laundry. Let's choose something random. She thinks that you should fold your laundry a certain way, all right? But you fold your laundry the way you want to, or maybe you don't even fold it. Maybe you throw it on the bed, all right? But that's the way you do it in your home, all right? Then every time she tells you, the answer is no, every single time. Well, you should really try to fold it this way because that would be better. No, right? This is the way I do it. Well, I understand that's the way you do it, but there's a better way. No, this is the way I do it. Well, I don't know why you're being so difficult. This would be so much easier for you. The answer is no. This is how I fold my laundry. And I know that's a rudimentary example, right? But if you're consistent, at a certain point, people are going to back off because, number one, nobody has energy to keep going on and on and on. But even if they do, after 10, 15, 20 times, they're going to get the picture. And I think something to reinforce is that a lot of times boundaries break down because people aren't willing to be consistent. A big reason is because they don't want to hurt people's feelings or because they don't want to be viewed negatively. But the seed I always plant with my clients and that I'll share with you guys is that if you're consistent and you hold boundaries for yourself and you communicate clearly, people are going to have a lot of respect for you, especially the people that you want to have respect for you, because odds are they're doing those things too. All right? The takeaway here today, the message is set boundaries. Don't be afraid to set boundaries. Don't let anybody dictate the way that you live your life. Now, it's okay to take feedback from other people, especially if, they've got some valuable insights into things that you may be messing up on, right? It's okay to take feedback from people, but if you're an adult listening to this, you've got to be consistent in your life and communicate what you're comfortable with and take care of yourself, which I think is kind of the ultimate point on top of boundaries. Is you will get infinitely better at setting boundaries, communicating them, the more you take care of yourself and the more you practice verbalizing them. All right. The actions will come. All right. So if you're listening to this And you're wondering, well, how do I take care of myself? Well, I would encourage reaching out for individual therapy is a wonderful first step. If you don't have access to those types of resources, then finding some type of community in your area, whether it's a hobby, a support group, or some kind of 12-step recovery support group, whatever it is, getting around other people who are taking care of themselves is another phenomenal step. And being around people who are practicing boundaries, who are communicating better ways, and this will infinitely help you. So I want to just encourage you to reach out for help if you need it. I want to encourage you to communicate boundaries in your relationships, no matter how hard it may seem, because it's going to benefit you, and it's going to make your day-to-day relationships with people that much better. If you like this information, stick around for more just like it. We're going to be posting videos pretty much daily, and it's going to be stuff a lot like this. If you're into information on boundaries, mental health, therapy, recovery principles, spirituality, then turn into Breaking the Cycle, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Love you. Bye.